Welcome, class. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 4, or Moral Relativism. If you are a regular subscriber to my YouTube account, and I'm not talking to the class now, but to those subscribers, the reason I've turned off the comments section on this particular video is because this video is intended for my ethics class at the university, and it's part of their learning experience to work not only within the classroom, but also to get some material online. And so that's what I'm doing primarily in this video, and just using my my account, my YouTube account, to perform that task. So class, this is primarily for you. As I was thinking about moral relativism, I was reminded of an example from my college experience. I went to a college near Buffalo, New York, and as you probably know, in Buffalo, New York can get rather cold during the wintertime. And there was a young woman who attended the college that I attended, and she always wore dresses. She even wore dresses in the wintertime when it was very cold, and she would shiver and complain about the cold. In fact, I remember correctly, she was from a Caribbean island. I can't remember which one. But she would complain about the cold. And of course, the question came up among her friends, why didn't she just wear slacks or pants during the winter? And finally, somebody worked up the courage to ask her. And her explanation was that her religion taught her that it was immoral for a woman to wear pants. It was part of her culture that women shouldn't wear pants, and so that's why she always wore a dress. Now, while she didn't expect the rest of us to agree that women wearing pants is immoral, she did expect us to respect that she felt it was immoral for her to wear pants. This, of course, is one example of potentially many where you can raise the question, can people disagree about the morality or immorality of some behavior and both be correct? Now, so far in the class, we've been studying views of morality that seem to suggest that there is a set of moral principles and values which are universal. And by universal, I just simply mean they apply to everyone. In ethics, this view is called Objectivism. Let me now give you a definition of Objectivism that will appear on your examination. Objectivism is the view that the same moral principles hold universally for every person in society. Let me give that to you again more slowly. Objectivism is the view that the same moral principles hold universally for every person in society. Now, objectivism has been challenged by another position in ethics called moral relativism. There are, according to your text, two versions of moral relativism: popular relativism and subjectivism. Here's the definition of popular relativism that will appear on your examination, so you need to write it down. Popular relativism holds the same moral principles hold for all members of a particular society, but may differ from one society to another. Again, and more slowly, popular relativism holds the same moral principles hold for all members of a particular society, but may differ from one society to another. And the other version of relativism, moral relativism, is called subjectivism. Subjectivism. And you should write this down as well because it will appear on your examination. Subjectivism is the view that moral principles hold for particular persons, but may differ from one person to another. Again, and more slowly, subjectivism is the view that moral principles hold for particular persons, but may differ from one person to another. So you can see that the difference between popular relativism and subjectivism is basically a difference between the morals being relevant to a society and the morals being relevant to an individual. And that they can differ from society to society in the case of popular relativism, but in the case of subjectivism, they can differ on a more microscopic level from one individual or one person to another. Now, objectivism holds that everyone is under the same moral principles, and that cultural differences should make no difference to the moral principles and values that people should live by. In fact, objectivism holds that differences in moral beliefs and practices do not nullify the moral rights and obligations that hold for everyone. Now, it's important to realize that objectivism does not require moral rigidity, especially in circumstances where objective moral principles might come into conflict. The classic example, and I think we may have even discussed this once already in class, is the example in World War II, where some people would hide Jews from the Nazis, and when asked by Nazis if they were hiding any Jews, they would lie and say, no, we're not hiding any Jews. Now, many of these people had the moral principle that you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't tell a lie. But they also had the moral principle that required them to protect human life. And so, in a sense, these two moral viewpoints came into a kind of conflict. But they were able to make moral decisions based on what they considered to be the more pressing or the more dominant moral principle that they should obey. So there's nothing about moral objectivism that prohibits one from violating one moral principle, like lying, in order to avoid violating another moral principle, like failing to protect a human life. Objectivism can adjust to circumstances. Now let's talk about popular relativism. Popular relativism holds there can be valid but differing moral standards among various societies and cultures. Moral standards are not universal as they are in objectivism. Belonging to a group, like a society or a culture, means you are bound to that group's moral standards, even if you don't personally agree with those standards. That means a majority in a group determines that group's moral standards. Subjectivism is different in some ways it's similar. In fact, subjectivism is kind of relativism on a holiday. It can be rather extreme in its relativistic posture. It holds there can be equally valid but differing moral standards among various individuals, even if those belong to the same culture and society. So, people in the same culture and society can have different moral standards, and their moral standards can be equally valid. And there simply just cannot be any guarantee that two individuals will hold the same moral assessment of the same behavior or practice. And if they don't, that's fine, according to the moral subjectivist. Both are equal, both views, even if they contradict each other, are perfectly valid. So as you can imagine, these three views of morality can come into considerable conflict philosophically. So let's evaluate now, first of all, subjectivism. There is a way in which subjectivism treats morality as if it were merely an expression of opinion that people can differ about without significant consequence. Like, say, differences over a favorite color. There's no harm in that. But considerable harm can result from differences of opinion about the morality of, say, murder or other kinds of behaviors that can cause considerable harm as well. Besides, people can have opinions about some matters and be wrong and just be incorrect. Some people believe that human beings have never set foot on the moon. Can one really correctly say that it is perfectly okay for me to commit armed robbery, but wrong for someone else to do the same thing under the same exact circumstances? So, how can two people doing the same thing under the same conditions both be correct? Subjectivism also violates one of morality's primary functions, namely to regulate how we relate to one another. If I can't assume that you and I share the same common moral principles, then how can I trust you to enter into a relationship with me of any description, whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship or a business relationship? Now, while it is true that people can prove to be untrustworthy even when we assume that there is a shared set of moral principles, that doesn't negate the fact that the basis of human relationships includes, in fact, even depends upon, the belief that others share common moral principles with us. But subjectivism completely denies us that assumption, an assumption that is arguably an indispensable condition for a relationship with another person. So, one wonders how useful subjectivism is in terms of relating to other people. Now let's talk about the argument for popular relativism. The argument for popular relativism depends in part on two observations. First, different societies evidence widespread differences in moral beliefs and practices. Second, the moral standards that actually hold for a given society are determined by what moral beliefs and practices are widely accepted in that society. And from this, popular relativism concludes, therefore, different moral standards should hold for different societies. So let me give you that argument again. As a matter of fact, that will probably, almost certainly, appear on your test in some fashion. This is the argument for popular relativism. First premise of the argument. Different societies evidence widespread differences in moral beliefs and practices. That's the first premise. Now the second premise. The moral standards that actually hold for a given society are determined by what moral beliefs and practices are widely accepted in that society. And the conclusion of the argument is, therefore, different moral standards should hold for different societies. So that's the gist of the argument for popular relativism. Now let's examine the argument closely. Consider the first premise of the argument, the first statement. Different societies evidence widespread differences in moral beliefs and practices. Now, in many cases, this is undeniably true. This is not just a premise in an argument, but it's virtually an observation, or as they say, one might say, it's empirically true. For example, polygamy. There are some societies in which polygamy is considered to be immoral, and other societies in which it is not. So, there's a case where different societies evidence a widespread difference on some moral belief and practice. But sometimes the differences among societies are only apparent. For example, there can be widespread agreement about an underlying moral principle, but disagreement about what behavior applies to the moral principle. Let me give an example of what I mean by that. Take the case of capital punishment. Some societies see capital punishment as murder, as state-sanctioned murder. Others do not. Others see it as a punishment, as a just desert for a heinous crime, usually the premeditating of another life. So some societies disagree on whether or not capital punishment constitutes murder. Yet, both societies can agree on the underlying moral principle that the premeditated killing of another human being who doesn't pose an imminent threat is morally wrong. So they can agree on something in common. They can start, as it were, from the same moral principles, but arrive at different conclusions about what behaviors exemplify those moral principles. Now, your book critiques the second part of the moral relativist argument, namely that premise that says the moral standards that actually hold for a given society are determined by what moral beliefs and practices are widely accepted in that society. Now, I happen to believe that the book makes a bad argument against popular relativism here. That argument can be found on page 59 of your book. So I'm not going to review the argument in depth, except to say that while the authors of the book might be correct, and I say might be correct, that moral standards reflect the way the world is universally, it is incorrect of them to suggest that popular relativists must hold a similar view. In fact, popular relativists deny that moral standards reflect the way the world is universally. Instead, they precisely argue that moral standards reflect the way the world is locally in a given society. So I don't see how the authors can use a standard against moral relativism that moral relativism rejects from the onset, out of hand. But your book does suggest another critique of the second premise of popular relativism that does have some validity in my view. Again, that second premise in the argument for moral relativism says, the moral standards that actually hold for a given society are determined by what moral beliefs and practices are widely accepted in that society. This would seem to suggest that a given society can never be mistaken about a matter of morality. If you really think about it, that's what it seems to suggest. But there is no reason to think that a majority of a society couldn't be as wrong about a matter of morality as they are about a matter of fact, like the shape of the earth. Just because a majority of people may have held that the earth was flat doesn't make it so. Why couldn't the same be said of certain moral beliefs and practices? One of the so-called virtues of popular relativism that is often used as an argument, and is often used as an argument in its favor. It's the virtue is tolerance, and the argument that is made based on tolerance is called the argument from tolerance. Let me now give you a definition of tolerance that you'll want to write down for your test. Tolerance demands that we respect the belief and practices of other people even when they conflict with our own. Again, tolerance demands that we respect the belief and practices of other persons even when they conflict with our own. The argument from tolerance, which you should write down because it will be on your test, says, the principle of tolerance requires that we respect the beliefs and practices of other societies. Again, the argument from tolerance says, the principle of tolerance requires that we respect the beliefs and practices of other societies. Now, many objections can be raised against this argument. First of all, should we really respect every moral belief and practice that some society holds? What if the beliefs and practices of some society are just absolutely appalling to us? Should we not object to those? Should we respect them nonetheless? Secondly, the argument from tolerance suggests that we shouldn't even evaluate and compare the moral practices of different societies to determine which ones might be more desirable. But why not? Why shouldn't we? Why should we be forbidden from making those kinds of comparisons, evaluations, and contrasts? Thirdly, the argument from tolerance is arguably self-contradictory because it prescribes a practice that everyone should hold universally about all societies and their moral beliefs and practices. What if I live in a society that morally obligates me to be intolerant of some other society's moral beliefs and practices? According to popular relativism, I should go along with what the majority of the people think. But if I go along with popular relativism with respect to its argument from tolerance, I don't know what to obey. Should I obey my society's dictates, or should I obey the principle of tolerance? Also, it is contradictory for popular relativism to argue, on the one hand, that moral beliefs and practices are not universal, but then argue, on the other hand, that the principle of tolerance should be held universally. So that's a contradiction. Let's talk about some other arguments against popular relativism that your book mentions. First of all, there is what's called, and you should write this down for your test, the horrific evils objection. The horrific evils objection. The argument goes like this, and just write it down. If relativism were true, then any sort of immoral practice could be morally acceptable as long as a society's majority accepts it. Again, if relativism were true, then any sort of immoral practice could be morally acceptable as long as a society's majority accepts it. That's the horrific evils objection. Now, one of the evils that was certainly used, well, a majority of people at one time held, was slavery. This kind of argument was used to justify slavery. And if relativism was true, and a majority of people held that belief and practice, then slavery was morally good, morally permissible. It also could be used in the case of genocide, killing, the mass murdering of certain people. But that's horrific. And why should we abandon our intuitions about the immorality of these practices merely because different societies differ in their moral beliefs and practices? Don't we just want to say that, yes, you may differ, Society X, and a majority of your people may think that that moral belief and practice is perfectly okay, but it's abhorrent. It's abhorrent. It's terrible. Why should we give up that intuition? Then there is also another argument used against popular relativism called the Reformer Objection. And you should write that down because this will be on your test as well. The Reformer Objection. It goes like this. If relativism were true, then the great moral reformers of history must be considered immoral because they opposed the accepted moral practices of their societies. Again, if relativism were true, then the great moral reformers of history must be considered immoral because they opposed the accepted moral practices of their societies. On the basis of moral relativism, people like Martin Luther King, in his opposition to the widely accepted practice of racial segregation, Martin Luther King, according to popular relativism, would be immoral because he went against the accepted moral practice of his society. Yet, it seems as if it's a benefit for us to have moral reformers come along from time to time and show us that our moral beliefs and practices are not as worthy of us as they could be. And this gives rise to the third objection against popular relativism, which you should also write down for your tests, and that is the moral progress objection. The moral progress objection. If relativism were true, then the notion of moral progress makes no sense because there is no objective standard to progress toward. Again, the moral progress objection states, if relativism were true, then the notion of moral progress makes no sense because there is no objective standard to progress toward. This leads many people to argue, and I think with some degree of plausibility, that moral progress only makes sense in the context of some form of an objectivist viewpoint of morality. Relativism precludes the very idea of moral progress. It can account for moral change, but not moral progress. In fact, moral progress must hold that the very idea of moral progress is nonsense. But it certainly seems as if abolishing slavery, again, for example, constitutes moral progress. So why should we surrender that intuition that moral progress is possible, in fact, even desirable, for the mere observation that some societies differ in their moral beliefs and practices? What follows from that observation? That moral progress isn't desirable? I mean, that doesn't follow at all. And then finally, the final objection to popular relativism is called the social groups objection. Again, the social groups objection. You should write this down because it also will appear on your test. And it goes this way. If relativism were true, then most people in modern pluralistic societies have no definite moral standard because most people belong to several social groups at once. Again, the social groups objection. If relativism were true, then most people in modern pluralistic societies have no definite moral standard because most people belong to several social groups at once. Now, many people in many nations belong to more than one social group. This is an observation that this this objection makes, which I think is unquestionably true. Belonging to a social group can depend on a lot of factors, like your age, race, ethnicity, religion, the region you live in, your social or economic class, and so on. So a lot of things can determine what social groups that you might belong to. Popular relativism doesn't seem to be particularly helpful for individuals living in pluralistic societies because it doesn't tell us what social group's majority opinion about moral beliefs and practices should guide us among the many social groups we can belong to. Let me repeat that again. Popular relativism doesn't seem particularly helpful for individuals living in pluralistic societies because it doesn't tell us what social group's majority opinion about moral beliefs and practices should guide us among the many social groups we belong to. So, since we can belong to many social groups at once that make different moral claims on us, then if relativism is true, then either no moral standard holds for us, or we are bound to many different, even contradictory moral standards at the same time, because we don't know which one simply to obey. Should I obey the moral standards of a cultural group that I belong to based upon my ethnicity, or should I obey a social group sort of orientation based upon my age group or some religion that I belong to? So we just don't know, and it doesn't seem that popular relativism can account for morality in a pluralistic society. So those are some of the objections that are raised against moral relativism. So thank you, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.